The Vraxian repossession fleet materialized at the edge of the solitary sector in a display of military precision that would have made any tactical academy weep with pride. 3,000 warships, each bristling with enough firepower to glass a continent, emerged from hyperspace in a perfect attack formation. Their target was Station Zero, a tiny, ancient outpost tethered to a dead star that the Vraxian hegemony had designated for immediate resource repositioning. High Admiral Karkas stood on his bridge, his secondary feeding tentacles curling with smug satisfaction as he surveyed the lone, silent station. To his sensors, the outpost looked like a primitive relic, a forgotten precursor experiment left running in the cold black. He had spent decades studying human psychology and had concluded that these bipedal creatures were nothing more than a convenient myth. Prey pretending to be predators who apologized even when you hurt them. "Send the hailing frequency," Karkas ordered, his voice dripping with the condescension of a species that had absorbed 17 civilizations in the past century alone. "Tell the custodian he has 10 minutes to vacate human property before we begin creative disassembly of his vessel." The view screen flickered to life, but it did not show a military commander in dress uniform. Instead, it revealed a middle-aged man in a simple gray suit, seated in a high-backed chair, cradling a ceramic mug. This was Silas. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like an economist or a bureaucrat who had lost his way to a trade summit. He took a long, slow sip of a toxic beverage humans called coffee, a literal poison they drank for entertainment. "Welcome to Station Zero," Silas said, his voice quiet and conversational. He did not seem to notice the 3,000 guns pointed at his head. "I'm afraid the star isn't for sale. It's currently occupied." Karkas let out a wet gurgle of laughter. "Occupied? By what? The ghosts of your primitive ancestors? You are a species that calls themselves peacekeepers because you are too soft for conflict, negotiating and writing treaties just to avoid the inevitable." To drive the point home, Karkas signaled his tactical officer. A precision kinetic slug was fired, slamming into the station's outer hull. The impact did not cause a breach, but the vibration sent Silas's ceramic mug tumbling from his small side table. It shattered into 50 jagged pieces on the floor. Silas looked down at the broken shards, a sentimental relic from a daughter on a distant colony. He took a long, slow breath through his nose, his face becoming an unreadable mask. When he looked back at the camera, he was no longer smiling. That was Stage 1. "Patient, friendly, and pleasant," Silas whispered, his voice carrying a weight that made the Admiral's scales itch with sudden primal unease. He cleaned his glasses with a small cloth and looked directly into the lens, his eyes reflecting something ancient and predatory. "And you just skipped directly to Stage 2, Karkas sneered, ignoring the warning instincts that were beginning to scream in the back of his primary brain. "And what happens at Stage 2, little human? Do you file a formal complaint? Do you write a strongly worded letter?" Silas did not answer. Instead, he pressed a single button on his console. Suddenly, every alarm on the 3,000 Vraxian ships erupted simultaneously. The dead star behind the station began to pulse with a biological energy signature so massive it defied every fundamental law of physics. On the tactical display, the star's corona began to unfurl like wings the size of battle cruisers. "No," Silas said, standing up with deliberate care. "Stage 2 is when I provide context. Stage 3 is when I stop making eye contact." "But you're making me think about skipping straight to Stage 4. Karkas stared at his screen as the star shifted, revealing an iridescent sheen that absorbed and reflected light in impossible ways. "What is that?" "The reason we stayed quiet for 300 years, Silas replied. Admiral Karkas stared at the tactical display as the dead star's energy readings went off the scale. The entity emerging from the corona was nearly 2 kilometers in length, its scales gleaming with an iridescent sheen that seemed to absorb the very light of the bridge. This was not a machine. It was a biological anomaly that violated every fundamental law of physics as the Vraxians understood them. "Admiral, we are detecting similar energy signatures emerging from the station's shadow," Lieutenant Voss reported, his voice climbing an octave in panic. "Multiple massive contacts. They were cold. They were just waiting for us to get comfortable." Silas remained standing in his quiet reading room, his eyes fixed on the shattered remains of his mug. He had progressed through approximately 17 different levels of internal management, his reserve of patience burning away like water on an airless moon. "You asked for context, Admiral," Silas said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried through the Vraxian communication grid. For 300 years, humanity has been the galaxy's favorite punching bag. We hauled your toxic waste, established colonies on death worlds that made your skin melt, and mediated your petty disputes with a smile. Silas looked back at the screen, his smile now tight around the edges. The hallmark of Stage 3. We did it because we were terrified of ourselves. We came from a world where we invented nuclear weapons before we invented space travel. We learned to be diplomats because the alternative was our own extinction. Karkas, however, was a product of the Vraxian cultural philosophy. Might makes right. He saw Silas's explanation not as a warning, but as a confession of weakness. A single ship and a handful of biological curiosities will not stop the hegemony, Karkas roared. Launch boarding pods. Secure the station. I want that human in a gravity cell by the next meal cycle. 12 stealth insertion pods, the finest tools of Vraxian conquest, launched from the flagship. They were filled with elite warriors trained in 17 different killing arts, each one costing more to equip than a small planetary defense system. They expected a frantic, uncoordinated defense from a panicked bureaucrat. Silas didn't even look at the tactical monitors as the pods impacted his station's docking ring. He simply began cleaning his glasses again. "This is your final warning, Admiral," Silas murmured. "Fix the problem you've created or face the consequences." The Vraxian boarding team breached the first airlock, their plasma rifles hot and their sensors searching for military-grade traps. The corridors were silent and dimly lit. They swept into a secondary storage bay, their lead warrior kicking aside a small, colorful object that sat in the center of the floor. It was a simple human child's toy, a spinning top made of heavy lead and bright paint. As the Vraxian's boot touched it, the toy didn't tumble. It began to spin with a high-pitched, horrible screeching noise. "Identify that sound!" The Vraxian commander barked into his comms. His tactical display didn't register a weapon. It registered a tactical screaming campaign that began to vibrate the molecules of their heavy armor. The toy wasn't just spinning. It was a localized breakdown in fundamental physical laws. As the Vraxian warriors realized their armor was beginning to melt from the toy's frequency, Silas's voice echoed through the station's intercom. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." Admiral Karkas watched the internal feed from the boarding party with mounting horror. His elite warriors, individuals who had each eliminated at least 50 high-value targets, were being systematically incapacitated by a spinning lead top. The frequency wasn't just noise. It was a localized harmonic disruption that convinced their molecular bonds to stop maintaining structural integrity. His warriors weren't dying in a glorious exchange of plasma fire. They were melting into the floorboards because a human child's toy had made their armor mathematically irrelevant. On the bridge of the Vraxian flagship, the tactical computers began to scream. "Admiral, the human is transmitting a data packet," Lieutenant Voss shouted, his hands flying across a console that was beginning to smoke. "It isn't a virus, it's a spreadsheet." Silas appeared back on the main view screen. He was no longer looking at the camera. He was looking at a data tablet, his expression as cold and clinical as a surgeon's. "You've spent 3 centuries assuming our patience was a sign of limited cognitive development," Silas said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "You saw our smiles and thought we were prey. You saw our treaties and thought we were soft. You missed the fundamental truth of human evolution. We didn't climb to the top of a death world food chain by being the strongest. We got there by being the most persistent and the best at accounting." Karkas's mandibles clicked in a frantic stress response. "Accounting? You threaten the hegemony with mathematics? War is just mathematics with higher stakes, Admiral," Silas replied, finally looking up. His eyes held the kind of compressed neutronium hardness that promised future violence. "We've been monitoring your fleet since you entered the heliopause 6 days ago. We've calculated your fuel consumption rates, your shield refresh cycles, and your ammunition expenditure patterns. My tactical computers have already run 17 million simulations of this engagement. In every single one, you lose." On the tactical display, the Vraxian formation, a perfect attack grid that had conquered 17 civilizations, began to flicker. The 215 human survey ships that had appeared from the star's shadow weren't moving to attack. They were repositioning into what the Vraxian computers identified as remedial training formations. "Sir, they are broadcasting on educational frequencies," Voss whispered, his skin turning a pale, shocked white. "They're using us as a demonstration model for their junior officers. They've labeled our flagship as a predictable target for predictive firing solutions." Silas adjusted his glasses. a gesture that signaled the transition to Stage 4. We sent an economist to this station because we genuinely hoped for a peaceful solution. But since you've insisted on an unconventional approach, I've had to authorize the activation of our automated distribution algorithms. It turns out that optimizing wheat production on Mars and optimizing orbital strike patterns use remarkably similar math. Karkas roared, a sound of pure defiance. Fire everything. I don't care about their math. Burn that station to ash. The Vraxian fleet unleashed a full-spread volley of heavy plasma. It was enough energy to crack a moon, a tidal wave of fire that should have vaporized Station 0 instantly. But the human survey ships didn't raise shields. They didn't even flinch. Instead, they deployed small, reflective breadcrumbs, micro-mirrors that caught the plasma and bounced it back at the Vraxian escorts from impossible angles. Grouping is decent, Admiral, Silas noted, tapping his tablet. But you're concentrating fire too much on the forward quadrants. You're currently rated at a CE on the fleet training leaderboard. The song of the entity was not melodic. It was a rhythmic pulse of subatomic vibrations that functioned as a biological magnetic field. On the Vraxian flagship, the very air began to taste like ionized copper as the ships started to unmake themselves at a conceptual level. Atoms forgot how to bond, and energy ceased to maintain its form. Karkas watched in silent horror as the hull plating of his finest cruisers began to flake away like autumn leaves. Not from fire, but because the human song had convinced the metal it no longer wanted to maintain its molecular structure. Silas sat back down in his remaining chair, pointedly ignoring the chaos on the monitors. You see, Admiral, humanity didn't just evolve on a Class 12 death world, he said, his voice now carrying the exhausted certainty of a seasoned diplomat. We survived it by learning to negotiate with the things that lived there before us. The nightmares we eventually locked away in our polar regions and deep continental fault zones. We call them our legacy. Suddenly, the tactical display flickered with thousands of new contacts. They had not jumped into the system. They had been there the entire time, masked by advanced stealth technology and minimal energy signatures. Human survey ships uncloaked from the asteroid shadows in the station's wake, their weapon signatures going hot and their shields at maximum. There were now 4,732 combat vessels, each painting the Vraxian fleet with targeting solutions simultaneously. Admiral, we are being pinged by a Terran Defense Coalition Priority Alpha, Voss whispered, his three eye clusters wide with the kind of genuine confusion reserved for watching someone try to drink molten metal. The holographic display materialized, but it was not a military officer who appeared. It was a woman from the Office of Resource Reclamation, who looked remarkably like an agricultural consultant. She possessed the particular expression humans wore when they were being very polite before they started shooting. "Hi, Admiral Karkas," she began, her voice professional and crisp. "We've reviewed the footage from Station 0. The destruction of a Level 4 sentimental relic, specifically the world's best Librarian mug, constitutes a direct violation of the Interstellar Cultural Preservation Act." She tapped a data pad with clinical precision. "The fine for such a violation is the transfer of 3 mineral-rich asteroid belts to human custody. Failing that, the immediate creative disassembly of your flagship will proceed." Karkas roared, his feeding tentacles rigid with fury. "You dare bill the hegemony for a piece of pottery in the middle of a war? We have 3,000 warships. You had 3,000. Silas corrected, finally making eye contact with a cold, predatory gaze. "Your current count is 1,842 and dropping. Our tactical prescience calculated your moves before you even made them. The Varsity Team has just arrived, and they are very particular about their accounting. The massive jump signature did not belong to a single ship, but to the Terran Defense Coalition battlecruiser Resolve, a vessel so gargantuan it blotted out the local star cluster. It arrived with the silent, heavy weight of an apex predator entering a room, its sensor array painting every Vraxian ship with a precision that made the hegemony's tactical computers freeze. Commander Patricia Wells appeared on Karkas's main display, her features arranged in that particular, terrifying expression humans wore when they were being very polite before they started shooting. "Admiral Karkas," she said, her voice calm in a way that promised future violence. "I believe you've been making things difficult for our custodian. On Earth, we have a saying: don't touch the books, and definitely don't break the furniture." Silas looked up from his data tablet, his eyes now hardened into something that reminded Karkas of compressed neutronium. "They have progressed past the educational portion of the evening, Commander. Silas said flatly. They have refused the bill for the property damage and attempted to board. I am afraid we are at stage 4. Karkas watched his screens in a state of barely controlled panic, as the Resolve did not fire its main plasma cannons. Instead, the human vessel released a swarm of entities that the Vraxian sensors could detect, but not meaningfully describe. Creatures with too many limbs and not enough faces that phased through the Vraxian hull plating, as if it were tissue paper. These were the things humanity had kept locked away for millennia, the proof that their ancestors had made bargains with nightmares that should not exist. We call these precision strikes, Silas explained, standing amidst the shards of his broken mug. They do not destroy ships in the conventional sense. They simply convince the atoms that they no longer want to maintain molecular bonds. Across the Vraxian fleet, warships began to dim and flicker. It was not a series of explosions, but a systematic unmaking. The Vraxian warriors found their reactors going cold and their life support failing, not because of a technical fault, but because the human annoyance had altered the local application of physical laws. Karkas clutched his command throne as the walls of his own bridge began to turn translucent, the metal itself forgetting how to be solid. Through the fading bulkheads, he could see the star behind Silas stretching out tentacles that split into molecular chains, existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. You thought we were a myth. A story to make your spawn behave, Silas said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. You thought absence of evidence was evidence of absence. But we were just being patient. And you have just reached the end of our patience. The sensation of unmaking did not end in death for High Admiral Karkas. Instead, the shimmering reality of his dissolving bridge snapped into a sharp, terrifying focus. One moment he was fading into cosmic dust. The next, he was standing in a small, quiet room, floored with warm wood and lined with thousands of physical books. The air smelled of old paper and the bitter, sharp scent of Silas's coffee. Karkas tried to roar, to reach for the ceremonial blade at his hip, but his appendages refused to move. He was held in place by a field of tactical prescience, a force that calculated his every intent and neutralized it before his muscles could even twitch. Silas sat across from him in a high-backed leather chair, a fresh ceramic mug in his hand. He looked tired, the kind of exhausted certainty that comes from decades of diplomatic service. Behind him, a massive observation window looked out onto the void where the Vraxian fleet had once been. Now, there was only a debris field of pretty explosions and floating wreckage. You're lucky, Admiral, Silas said quietly, not looking up from a leather-bound volume. Humans are surprisingly forgiving when you give their children back. But you didn't take a child. You took peace. You forced us to remember our nature. Karkas's translator, somehow still functioning, crackled. You are monsters. You play at being diplomats while keeping gods in cages. We are predators who chose to become diplomats because we understood the alternative was our own extinction, Silas corrected, finally looking up. His eyes didn't hold rage. They held the stage 4 annoyance that signaled the end of all patience. On Earth, we have the Annoyance Protocol. It's a simple rule. If a human says they are getting annoyed, you fix the problem immediately. You didn't fix it. Silas stood and walked to the window, gesturing toward the star that was still unfurling its multi-dimensional wings. You thought this was a mining outpost. It isn't. This is a lock on a door we built 8,000 years ago. We didn't want to conquer the galaxy. We wanted to be left alone to develop on our own terms. The Admiral watched as the biological entity began to drift toward the Vraxian home sector. It wasn't attacking. It was hunting by scent. The scent of the hegemony's unique warp signatures. Every species we've fought has either been destroyed or become a close ally within 5 years, Silas said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. There is no middle ground in human military doctrine. You either annihilate or assimilate. We prefer the latter, but you've made a very strong case for the former. Karkas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What are you going to do to us? I'm not going to do anything, Silas replied, setting his mug down with a soft click. But the Varsity Team, the ones who actually enjoy this sort of thing, they just received your voting records. They know exactly who authorized the strike on this station. The wall of books did not simply vanish. It folded into the station's superstructure, revealing that the quiet reading room was the literal eye of a storm. As Station Zero's engines hummed with a frequency that made the vacuum of space ripple, the dead star, the biological lock, began to drift toward the Vraxian home sector with the slow, inevitable grace of an executioner. Silas stood perfectly still, his hands folded behind his back, looking not like a warrior, but like a teacher who had finally run out of patience with a particularly dim student. "You keep calling us monsters, Admiral, but you fail to understand the mathematics of our survival," Silas said, his voice flat and clinical. "We didn't send a general to this station because a general would have only seen your fleet as a target to be destroyed. I see you as a series of variables in a failing equation." Karkas watched a secondary holographic display that Silas flicked into existence. It wasn't a tactical map of a battlefield. It was a real-time audit of the Vraxian hegemony's entire infrastructure. The Admiral's secondary heart nearly stopped as he saw the red lines of human cyber attacks infiltrating his homeworld's power grids, water reclamation systems, and medical distribution networks. "We've been in your systems for 73 cycles, watching and waiting." Silas tapped a line of scrolling data. "Your entire species would fall apart if we stopped selling you the medications you need to survive in standard oxygen environments. We've been your janitors, your haulers, and your errand boys, and in that time, we've learned every single one of your weaknesses." "This is extortion!" Karkas shrieked, his tentacles trembling. "This is a negotiation you've already lost because you mistook our kindness for weakness?" Silas's expression was cold, reflecting the Stage 4 annoyance that now dominated the room. "The Varsity Team isn't coming to fire plasma cannons at your cities. They are accountants, sociologists, and engineers. They are coming to dismantle the hegemony piece by piece through logistics and economic necessity." Silas pulled up a red list that made Karkas's scales turn a sickly, transparent green. It contained the names, real-time coordinates, and biological signatures of every Vraxian politician and military commander who had voted for the repositioning of Station Zero. "We don't do half measures anymore, Admiral," Silas said, stepping closer to the viewport. "We learned the hard way on our own world that leaving an aggressor with the tools for future conflict only guarantees more death. We either annihilate the threat or we assimilate the culture into something better. Your leadership has been deemed a non-viable variable." A new fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel behind the station. Unlike the survey ships, these were massive, blocky vessels with no windows and no markings other than a simple Terran audit seal. They didn't move like warriors. They moved with the eerie, coordinated grace of a machine. "The first fleet has arrived to begin the transition," Silas announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "They will not start a war, Admiral. They will simply end your civilization as you know it by proving that your continued resistance is statistically impossible." Cliffhanger. As the lead human audit ship began a tractor beam sequence on the Admiral's drifting flagship, Silas turned away from the window and asked a question that chilled Karkas to his core. "Would you like to see the final calculation, or shall we skip straight to the sentencing?" Admiral Karkas looked at the holographic sentencing and felt a weight settle over his soul that no orbital bombardment could match. The humans were not going to execute him. They were going to make him a participant in their own meticulous, terrifyingly efficient order. "Your hegemony is being restructured into a mutual defense pact," Silas said, his voice returning to the gentle, polite tone of Stage 1. "You will find our terms are annoyingly solid and undeniably correct. We have already redirected your asteroid mining operations and restructured your trade routes to ensure that any future conflict is mathematically irrational." The Vraxian High Admiral watched as the massive human audit ships began to broadcast new educational protocols across the hegemony's core worlds. His warriors were being given mandatory species identification training to ensure they never again mistook a human for prey. They were being taught that the creatures they had tried to exploit were the same apex predators who had climbed their way out of a death world hell through rivers of blood and mountains of corpses. "We are apex predators, Admiral," Silas continued, taking a final sip of his coffee. "We just happened to develop table manners because they made survival easier and more profitable than extinction. But when you break our things and threaten our peace, you remind us of the history we have tried so hard to outrun. The dead star, the great biological entity, began to return to its slumber, folding its impossible wings back into the corona as the lock on the gate was restored. The Resolve and the Varsity Team began their jump sequences, leaving behind a sector that had been demonstrated into absolute submission. "Go home, Karkas," Silas said, finally looking away from the Vraxian. "Tell your council that Earth remembers everyone who tried to claim us. Tell them we have a long memory and an even longer reach. And suggest they try knocking first next time." As the Vraxian flagship was escorted out of the sector by a single human survey ship, Karkas watched Station Zero shrink into a tiny speck of light against the void. He realized that the galactic balance of power had shifted forever. The humans had not just won a battle, they had enforced a new reality where spreadsheets and probability matrices were more dangerous than any plasma cannon. Back on the station, the corridors were quiet again. Silas walked to the reading room and sat in his high-backed chair. He picked up a new ceramic mug, a plain one this time, and looked at the shattered pieces of the old one still on the floor. Some lessons you only need to learn once, he whispered to the empty room. He leaned back, opened his book, and allowed himself a small, unsettling smile that showed just a hint of teeth. The librarian was back on duty, and from the back row he could see everything. 5 standard cycles had passed since the Vraxian audit, and the face of galactic diplomacy had been permanently reshaped. The Annoyance Protocol was no longer a whispered rumor. It was the foundational text for every first contact team in the known universe. Training modules now taught every species to recognize the Stage 3 careful breathing and the Stage 4 quiet declaration of irritation as the final warnings before a civilization-ending event. High Admiral Karkas, now a low-level trade observer for the restructured hegemony, stepped off the transport onto the docking ring of Station Zero. He moved with a newfound humility, a trait his species had only learned after their entire infrastructure was dismantled by human accountants with warships. As he approached the librarian's quarters, he noticed a new plaque on the door. "Welcome. Please don't make me kill you." Inside, Silas was seated in the same leather chair, though the room was now filled with gifts from a dozen terrified yet grateful civilizations. He was sipping from a new ceramic mug, his eyes fixed on a holographic spreadsheet detailing the shared resource management of the Turkian sector. "You returned," Silas noted without looking up, his voice retaining that exhausted certainty that comes from decades of keeping the peace. "I came to understand," Karkas replied, his feeding tentacles curling in a gesture of respect. "The galaxy is quiet now. The Krell and the Valdrine negotiate over grain tariffs instead of orbital bombardments. The Vorquil have abandoned their right of strength for shared access. But I still don't understand how you do it. How you maintain this peace without firing a single shot since our defeat." Silas set his mug down with a soft click, and finally made eye contact. "Because we made you do the mathematics yourselves, Admiral. We didn't defeat you through bravery or honor. We defeated you through accounting. We proved that the cost of violence is exponentially higher than the profit of cooperation. We didn't destroy your illusions about us. We destroyed your illusions about warfare itself." Karkas looked out the observation window at the dead star. It remained dormant, a sleeping god held in check by the human custodian. "And the monsters? The ones you woke up to unmake my fleet? They're back in their cages sleeping," Silas said, a tired smile touching his lips. "They know we only need them when the galaxy stops listening to the diplomats. We told them the galaxy belongs to them now. A universe cleansed of species arrogant enough to believe firepower makes them invincible." Silas stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the vast, silent dark. "Humanity didn't climb to the top of our food chain by being weak. We got there by being terrifying when we needed to be, and then choosing to be better than our history. We smile because we're happy, not because we don't have teeth." "So you will stay here? In the back row?" Karkas asked. "Absolutely," Silas replied, his reflection in the glass showing the calm, patient face of a predator who had chosen to be a librarian. "Power isn't about where you sit, Karkas. It's about what you can see. And from the back row, we can see everything. We can see who is honest, who is hiding something, and who is about to make a very... As Karkas turned to leave, he realized the final truth of the human paradox. They were the most dangerous species in the galaxy precisely because they didn't want to be dangerous. They were predators with table manners, guarding the peace not with weapons, but with the terrifying promise of what would happen if they ever stopped being patient. "Goodbye, Silas," Karkas said. "Goodbye, Admiral," Silas replied, already returning to his book. "And please, try to keep the noise down. I'm starting a very interesting chapter." Silas watched the Vraxian transport disappear into the shimmering distortion of warp space, leaving Station Zero in its accustomed silence. The deep, thrumming heartbeat of the biological lock behind him settled into a low-frequency purr, the ancient entity returning to its dreamless sleep. He walked back to his desk and picked up a small, hand-painted wooden box that had arrived on the morning's priority supply shuttle from Earth. Inside was a new ceramic mug, its surface smooth and cold. It didn't bear the title of World's Best Librarian or Galaxy's Admiral. This one was simple, white, with a single human word etched into the bottom in gold leaf: patience. It was a gift from the Varsity Team, the accountants and engineers currently overseeing the creative disassembly of the Vraxian military-industrial complex. A final notification blinked on his secondary screen: a secure channel transmission from Admiral Wells of the Resolve. Audit complete. The hegemony has been moved to the supervised evolution category. Their leadership has accepted the mathematics of the new trade accords. Enjoy the quiet, Silas. We'll keep the noise down on our end. Silas took a sip of the fresh coffee, the heat grounding him. He looked at the small glass display case on his wall where the jagged, glued-together shards of his old mug were now kept. It wasn't just a trophy of a victory, it was a cautionary tale. He knew that across the galaxy, thousands of species were now updating their annoyance protocols, teaching their children to never mistake a human's smile for a lack of teeth. They had learned that humans were the most dangerous species in the void precisely because they would sacrifice billions of lives and wait centuries just to prove a point about logistics. Silas sat back, opened a leather-bound book, a tactical manual regarding unconventional resource management, disguised as a collection of 20th century poetry, and began to read. The galaxy was at peace, governed by spreadsheets, probability matrices, and the terrifying memory of what happened when the librarian stopped being nice. As long as the silence stayed unbroken, the monsters would stay under the bed. 12 assassins on a Tuesday? Silas whispered to the quiet room, a small, unsettling smile touching his lips. Next time, I hope they send a poet.